Okay, welcome back, and let's go ahead and get started. So, I think some. Okay, so just a reminder that the midterm two is due today, and I think most of you already emailed that to me. But just make sure you get that in today or tonight if you haven't done so already. It looks like some students just sent theirs in, so you have until the end of today. But just make sure by sometime, if you haven't done it already, just send me your midterm two today. And yep, that's the first thing. Okay, so we're going to start the next. So we're pretty much 2/3 of the way through the course, and so I think we've finished 10 meetings. And we have 5 more, so 5 more meetings, and so the remainder of the course, we're going to move to the macroeconomic stuff, and so we finished all kind of the intro. We finished all the microeconomics I want to cover, and now the last um, chapters 10 through 15, and the last 5 lectures or so will all be on macroeconomics, and so we're kind of pivoting here, and so I think I think the macroeconomics material you might find a little bit easier. I'm not 100% positive, but I think it'll be a nice change. And so today we've got a couple chapters to do, but they're not too bad. Kind of intro to macroeconomics and some key variables. So from now on for the rest of the semester, we'll be moving on to macroeconomics, and we finished everything I wanted to cover with microeconomics. So we're done with that. All right, so we'll start doing chapter 10, which is kind of intro to macroeconomics and some key terms we need to learn. Okay, so you can open up the chapter 10 study guide. Okay, and I'm going to open up the chapter 10 PowerPoint as well. All right, let's get started with the macroeconomics. So chapter 10, GDP and economic growth. So the very first thing we're going to learn in macroeconomics is something you're probably familiar with. If not, we'll spend some time on it. But that's gross domestic product. Okay, let's introduce the definition of gross domestic product, and let's talk about how we account and measure for that. Let's start with this on slides 2 to 4. Okay, so we're going to learn about some key macroeconomic indicators or variables tonight, and these are all big topics in the news because the economy has been up and down lately, mostly down. But I'll show you kind of the trends, the actual data of these variables a little bit later. But first, let's just kind of understand what they are. So, the gross domestic product, or GDP, is the broadest measure of productivity in an economy. So what this measures is aggregate output, And the idea here is that if the economy can produce or does produce more, then the economy is doing well or better than it could. And if it's producing less or less than it did before, then that's an indicator that the economy is not doing well. Obviously, like it did a few months ago. Okay, so this is a monetary measure, meaning that we have to get this if we're looking at U.S. dollars. That GDP has to be measured in the dollar value or the U.S. dollar value of that productivity. And we'll talk about how you account for this in a minute, but there's a few things you want to avoid so you don't double count. Okay, so it's the market value of final goods and services, and so that means that we're going to not count like intermediate goods, like if we're taking the dollar value of like a new car, then you don't want to include all the like component parts that go into it, or if you're talking about a new iPhone, then all the intermediate parts or like the resources that go into it, those don't count. It's only the final good of new goods and services, the final value. Okay, so we'll ignore all those intermediate goods and only count the final good that's sold in the market. And we'll count the value added. So if you look at this next slide, this shows you that you have to kind of translate it or put it into dollar values, because just looking at the number of things that are produced, that's not a very good comparison of the productivity of the economy. And so if you're just looking at sofas and computers and how many you produce of each, you don't really know how much that's worth or how much that the value of that until you translate that or put that into dollar values. So you got to put everything into dollar values before you can determine what the actual GDP is. Okay, and so we're not going to include financial transactions because that's not a measure of how the economy is doing. That's just like sending money from point A to point B, or like a financial transaction, like any of these things, like a public transfer payment. So like the Okay, so those big government stimulus payments that came in March or April, or whenever the individual got them, that doesn't like individuals getting more money in their pocket or their bank account doesn't add to GDP. So that would be an example, a good example of a public transfer payment that doesn't add or subtract GDP. But if the consumer who gets the stimulus check buys something that adds to new productivity, that would increase GDP. So sending money around, like public transfer payments, like stimulus checks from the government, or any kind of payment, any kind of like welfare payment, that doesn't that doesn't count for GDP. But if the money goes to something that leads to new productivity in the production of a new good or service, then that does add to GDP. Okay, so you don't include any transfer payments, public or private, bond market transactions. That's nothing's being produced. You're just one person's owning the stock or bond, and then it's going to another person. So this is just moving money around. So these things that any of these financial transactions don't add to GDP, and you don't count them. But they can result in new productivity if the individual buys more things. Okay, and also no secondhand sales are included. So any used cars or anything on eBay or anything like that, any used textbooks, that was already counted in when it was a new good or service. So don't count it if it's sold. So secondhand sales don't go into GDP. Okay, so since we have an idea of what GDP is, and again, we'll look at the actual data in a little bit to see how it's changed in the recent months. But let's look at how it's measured and how you account for it. So we're going to use this idea called the expenditure approach, and that's on slides 5 through 8. Okay, so the expenditure approach is to count up. So there's a couple ways to measure GDP. This is the easiest one, and this is the one that's taught most widely in textbooks. And what we're going to use is the expenditure approach. So to account for or try to measure um, what GDP is during a certain period of time, you can either sum up or estimate how much was spent, or you can sum up how much was produced. Now, it's much easier to do the expenditure approach, and so that's what we're going to do. That's how we're going to measure GDP, is to use this approach and basically count up the sum of money spent buying the final good. So we're kind of going to break this into 4 categories, and once you add all those things together, that's the best estimate we have of how much GDP there is in the economy in dollar values. So there's this equation we're going to get to. Okay, this one here. So we're going to go through the items that comprise this GDP expenditure approach, but there's 4 categories. Big C, which is consumer spending, how much is spent by consumption, and I subscript G. Okay, that's gross private investment, and this is essentially business spending. And we'll go through these in more detail in a minute, but just presenting the terms. Okay, and then big G is government spending, or what is spent in the public sector, and then X subscript N, that is net exports. So that's exports minus imports. Okay, so the idea here is that if you measure what's spent on GDP, it's got to go into one of these 4 categories. And so you got to put it into the right category, and then you sum up all these things together. And the total dollar value of all these things during a certain period of time is the best measure we have for calculating GDP. Okay, so normally, so we're going to use this equation a bunch of times. I'd probably tell you to, I'd probably tell you to memorize it if it was normal times, but since it's going to be a take-home final and take-home homework, so you don't have to memorize it because you can just refer to the equation. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 individual items or categories that comprise the GDP expenditures approach. All right, so big C is the technical term is personal consumption expenditures. Just think of this as consumption spending by households and individuals. Okay, so if you add up all the money spent on new durable consumer goods, new non-durable consumer goods, new services, and plus any foreign goods purchased, produced. So if you sum up all the money spent by households and individuals on consumption goods, then that's what comprises consumption spending or personal consumption expenditures. All right, so that's category 1, big C. Okay, the next category is probably the most unfamiliar because it's essentially just means like business spending or private spending. Okay, so the IG is just gross private domestic investment, and you can think of that as just business spending. And so don't think of it as like investment in like stocks and bonds or things or anything like that, mutual funds. It really what this just means is business spending or private spending by businesses. So any money spent by private businesses or firms on new goods and services goes into this category. All right, so any money spent on new machinery, computers, equipment, tools, all construction, so new buildings, new stores, new warehouses, any new inventory that hasn't been sold, but you still have to put a dollar value on that. Okay, and so this is essentially capital. So all the new money spent on capital by private firms and private businesses is what we're talking about with private domestic investment. Okay, so when you see investment, just think of business spending. Okay, so the final two spending categories are what's spent by the public sector, government purchases, a big G, and so this is what's spent for new goods and services by the government or the public sector. Okay, so any public money that goes to buy a new good or service goes into this category. Okay, and then the final category is XN, and this is net exports. Okay, and net exports are exports minus imports, and this might seem a little weird at first, but the reason why we have to add exports and subtract imports is because GDP is what's spent on goods produced in the U.S. Okay, so GDP is the dollar value of new goods produced within the country's borders, and here we're talking about the U.S. And so that means that I'm trying to explain why we're using net exports. Okay, so exports are new goods and services that were produced in the U.S. and bought by international buyers, and so sorry that so that still adds to the current countries or the U.S.'s GDP because those goods were produced in the U.S. and that's a measure of how productive the U.S. was. Now imports, okay, those were produced by another country by definition, and so that goes into their GDP. All right, so whatever country produces the goods that the U.S. consumers buy, that those goods were not produced within the U.S. borders, and those don't go to our productivity. That goes in the other country's GDP. Okay, so exports go into GDP because that accounts for productivity. Imports come out because that goes into some other countries, that goes into their GDP. Okay, if you put okay, if you put all these things together, there's four categories that you can spend. Big C, okay, which is consumer spending. Investment, which is private business spending. Big G, which is government spending, and XN, which is net exports, and that's essentially international spending. So if a new good or service is bought it's got to go into one of these categories. So you put it in the category, and you sum all these together, and that's the measure of GDP that we have. Okay, so since we've talked a little bit about GDP, we're going to do some more examples on that. But we got the general idea, and we got the general approach of how you measure it. So let's now talk about nominal versus real GDP on slides 10 to 11. Okay. So this part's important because when we're measuring or comparing GDP, we have to put it into one year's base price because that essentially controls for inflation. Okay, so GDP is in dollar values, like we said, but if you compare like GDP 2020 to GDP in like 1950 prices, it's going to look way different because there's been inflation and things have changed. So you got to put them on the same base year and adjust for inflation, and that's what we talk about when we're using real GDP. Okay, so real GDP puts them in a base year, and you put them on the same scale, and that way you can actually compare what's happened to GDP, and it takes out the effect of inflation. Okay, so real GDP just means adjusted for inflation. All right, so we'll do an example like this in the exercises, but the idea here is that here we have 5 years, and this is just, let's assume there's just one good. I think this, what is this? Pizza. So these are different quantities of pizza produced, and these are the nominal prices. So the price in year one, the price in year two, and so you can see the price changes. So to make an accurate comparison, you got to put them on. You got to pick one of the years as the base, and then put all the other ones on that base year. Okay, so you essentially create a price index, and you use that index to convert the other years to that base year. All right, so you have nominal GDP, which is just how much was spent, just the price times quantity, and then you have adjusted GDP, which puts them all on the same scale, all on the same base year. Okay, so we'll do an example of this in the exercises, but this is the idea: is you want to pick a base year and put all the other years on that base year because then they'll be in real GDP based on that year's prices. Okay, so we have to put GDP on the same scale, which is in real terms for some base year. And once you do that, you can look at economic growth or kind of what happens to GDP over time. So let's look at slide 12 here. Okay, so sorry, an increase in real GDP or real GDP per capita, which I'll define in a second, over some period of time is economic growth. And then if you have a decline, that's negative economic growth, I guess. Okay, so when you're looking at growth, it's always in percent terms, like 1% or negative half a percent or whatever happened. So the percent change is the growth or the non-growth. Okay, so we know what real GDP is. That's adjusted for inflation, and then the other term that we need to define is real GDP or GDP per capita. Okay, and this is real GDP adjusts for inflation, and then real GDP per capita or just anything per capita that adjusts for population growth. So GDP per capita, not per capital. GDP per capita is GDP adjusted for population growth. And so what we're trying to do is take out the effects. So if there's inflation, that's just a general increase or decrease in the price level. And if there's population growth, you want to take that effect out because those things don't change GDP, don't change productivity. So you want to see the real effect by controlling for inflation and by controlling for population growth. All right, so GDP per capita is very easily calculated. You take the population and you divide GDP by the population. Okay, so in different years, this is real GDP. This is the population, and you want to see what as a per person indicator. What is GDP? So this divided by this, and so this is real GDP or an estimate of it in $2009. So real GDP per capita in $2009 was about 14,000. Real GDP per capita in $2009 in 2015 was about 50,000 per person. So it's just GDP per person. So per capita means per person. The real term means it's adjusted for inflation. Okay, and then so we're going to use the expenditures approach to measure GDP, which is to sum up all the four individual spending categories like this. Okay, there's another way to measure GDP, which is kind of the productivity approach. And so you can also measure or estimate GDP if you take the hours of work, the total labor hours worked in the US over a certain period of time, and multiply that by the productivity, which is output dollars per hour. And so that'll give you another estimate of GDP. So if you look at slide 19, it's a pretty simple equation, but all right, so this shows you that if you isolate GDP into two terms, which are hours of work and labor productivity. So the hours of work is, the size of the labor force and the average hours of work. So this is essentially the total hours of work for the whole U.S. economy during some period of time, usually like a quarter or a month. And then productivity is any change in technology, the quality of capital, education and training, which is human capital, any more efficiency or other. So this is labor productivity, which is the average output per hour. So this is how much hours are worked, and this is how productive those hours are in dollar terms. And so if you multiply hours times dollars per hour, you get a dollar value measure of real GDP. So this times this is a good estimate of GDP. So you can see here that if you wanted to, based on this approach, if you want to increase GDP or have economic growth, you have you have two things you can do. You can either uh, increase the number of work hours, so just more hours of work, or you can have those hours be more productive. Okay, so these are two ways, or both. So the ways in which you can get increased economic growth or increase productivity, work more hours as a whole, or have those hours be more productive. Like each hour produces more in terms of dollar output. Okay, so we'll look at some examples of measuring GDP with the expenditures approach, and we'll look at some examples of measuring GDP with the kind of labor productivity approach. All right, and so let me show you. So I defined here GDP and GDP per capita. So let me show you what I can pull up some data real quick and show you what this has looked like over the recent months because there's been some drastic changes. All right. So the good thing about macroeconomics is it's most of the data is public because you're looking at the public sector, and so a really good website that has a bunch of free data is the Federal Reserve Economic Database. And so if you go to FRED data, it'll take you to this page. I think I have a link in the other study guide, but it's easy to find. It's free. It's updated monthly or quarterly. So the Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED, from the St. Louis Fed. Okay, so you can go here, this website, and you can type in any key term. So we've learned about GDP. So let's just look for that. All right, so there's a bunch of different search results, but usually the top one is the most relevant or the highest rank. So here's real gross domestic product. And so this is the actual data reported by the Federal Reserve. So this is in $2012. Okay, and this is updated quarterly, and this is real GDP in $2012 quarterly. So you can see that here's quarter 4 for 2019, and there's, as you probably expected or you heard in the news or seen, there's a big drop in quarter 2, and the productivity has somewhat gone up recently, but it's still below where it was last year. So here's that big drop when the economy completely shut down, and you can see that kind of drop off there. Okay, so here's quarter 4. Quarter 1 wasn't too bad yet. Then quarter 2. So quarter 1 is January, February, March. The quarter 2 is April, May, June. Okay, and here's quarter 3. So you'll get a new report after the close of every quarter. So like January 1st or around Christmas, they'll report what the GDP was for quarter 4. Okay, so really, if you look at this whole or this whole historical data, what happened from quarter 1 to quarter 2, probably the most significant drop that we've seen in 70 years. Okay, and I can also show you GDP per capita. So you'll get the same trend, but it shows like per person. All right, so in some ways, this one's a better benchmark because it makes more sense like per person. So like GDP per capita, like if you take all GDP and divide it per person, then on average that's about 56,000 per person, okay, per adjusted annually. And so you can see that drop off here from quarter one to quarter two in this year, where GDP per capita went from 57,000 to 52. So that's a huge drop in per capita terms, $5,000 in just a quarter. So in both indicators, you can see the clear effects of the economic shutdown, and so the economy's grown a little bit since then. But here's that shutdown. Okay, so GDP, how we measure GDP with the expenditures approach, what nominal and per capita means, and then economic growth is an increase or decrease. I mean, an increase in GDP over time. And then we have the productivity approach, where to increase GDP, you either need to have more hours worked or increase the productivity of those hours, or both. All right. So there's a bunch of optional videos. There's a whole intro to macroeconomics. I'd recommend that one. There's a couple Khan Academy ones where talks about more of the components of GDP. This talks about accounting for, like where did this go or where doesn't it go. So you can take a look at those if you get some time. Okay, so let's look at some examples. And so number one, which of the following are included in this year's GDP? Okay, so let's just note. So this is a good exercise to see like what goes in or what doesn't, or where it goes. So A, the services of a commercial painter in painting the family home. So if a painter just paints his or her family's home, and there's no dollar value sale for that, it's just like a service by him or her. It could be a female painter. That's not included because there's no transaction of sale. All right, so if a professional painter or professional anything just does something, as like a hobby, like just paints someone's house, or a doctor does some medical service without reporting it, that isn't included because you got to have some record of it. So not included. Okay, B, an auto dealer's sale of a new car to a non-business customer. It doesn't really matter who the customer is, but the sale of a new car, yeah, that's a new good or service, so that's included, right? That goes into probably, or it doesn't. We don't know because we don't know who bought it. But new car, that is included in GDP. C, the money received by Smith when she sells her biology textbook to a used book buyer. So remember, don't include secondhand sales. That textbook got included when it was a new textbook. So if it gets sold again, not included. All right, but the publication and sale of a new economics textbook, that's a new good, so that gets included. So if it's a new good or service, you account for it. Okay, E, a 2 billion increase in business inventories. So this is included because this is business spending. So even if the good or service doesn't get sold, if it's produced, like it adds to their inventory. So this goes into the gross private investment. So any increase or decrease in inventories, that's a change in the productivity. So that's included. Okay, then government purchases of a newly produced aircraft. So that's a new aircraft produced by the big G category, government spending, so that's included. Okay, so you can see if it's a new good, it gets included somewhere. If it's a used good or if it's something that's just not reported, like a painter painting his house and not there's no transaction, then that's not included. All right, number two, this is where we're going to use the expenditures approach. All right, so we got a list of things using the following, whatever this acronym is, National something, NIPA data, compute GDP, and all figures are in billions. So we got personal consumption expenditures, we got wages and salaries, we have imports, corporate profits, depreciation, gross private domestic investment, we have government purchases, and we have exports. So we're going to use our equation where we know that GDP equals consumption expenditures plus gross private investment plus government spending plus net exports. And net exports are defined again as just exports minus imports. All right, so big C is personal consumption expenditures. That's 245 billion. That goes here. IG is gross private domestic investment. That is 86 billion. That goes here. G is government purchases, which is 82 billion. Okay, and then we have the separate categories for exports and imports. So XN is net exports, which is exports minus imports. So in parentheses, we have exports, which is 9 billion, minus imports, which is 18 billion. Okay, so this is exports, this is imports. So it doesn't matter if this is bigger than this. It's often the case that imports are bigger than exports in the US. So this is going to be a subtraction, but you have to make sure you account for it because the exports go for this year's GDP. The imports go to some other country's GDP. Okay, so we get 245 plus 86 plus 82 minus 9, and we get a GDP here of 404 billion. Okay, so to use this approach, just take all the categories and put them in their proper spot and then add up everything. And you get a good measure of the expenditures approach of accounting for GDP. Okay, everybody doing okay so far? Okay, great. So let's look at number three, and number three is a good example of how we use a base year and put in this is how we do a simple example of transforming to real GDP. So suppose that in 1984 the total output in a single good economy was 7,000 buckets of chicken. Also, suppose that in 1984 each bucket of chicken was priced at $10, and let's assume that in 2004 the price per bucket of chicken was 16 and that 22,000 buckets were produced. Okay, so let's determine real GDP for 1984 and 2004 in 1984 prices. So 1984 is going to be the base year. All right, so the point here is that we can't just look at uh, total buckets of chicken produced. We have to see how much those are in some base year and then we can make a comparison. All right, so this is from the PowerPoint. So I just wanted to show that you kind of use these categories, and then we can transform real GDP into nominal GDP. Okay. So here are the years: 84 and 2004. Here's the quantity, so 7,000 and 22,000, and here were the nominal prices. $10 and then $16 per bucket. Okay, and what I like to do for the index is pick the year and then make that index 1. And so what you can do for the index is divide all the nominal prices by the base year price, and then by default the base year price is going to be 1. So divide all this is our base year, 1984. So let's divide all the prices by that year's price, which is 10. So 10 divided by 10 is 1, this is the base year. Okay, and then 16 divided by, so nominal price of 16 divided by the base year price of 10 gives us an index of 1.6. All right, so the base year index is always going to be 1, and the other year's index is going to be something different. So we'll use those indices to convert from nominal to real GDP. All right, so nominal GDP is easy because you just take the price of the good and multiply it by the quantity. So 10 times 7,000 over here is 70,000 nominal prices, and then the next year, or 2004, 22,000 times 16 is 352,000. So these are the nominal prices. So this is GDP in 84 prices. And this is GDP in 2004 prices. But we got to put them in the same scale, in this case, 1984 prices, so we can make an accurate comparison. And we're going to put them in real GDP with base year 1984. So to do that, all you have to do is divide the nominal GDP by that year's index. Okay, so nominal GDP is 70,000, and this index is 1. So for the base year, you should always get and check that the nominal GDP and the real GDP are the same, because the base year is just 1, right? So see how they're both 70,000? And that's because we chose that year as the base year. So, but the process is the same. To calculate real GDP, take the nominal GDP price and divide it by that year's index that you calculated before. Okay, so for 2004, let's take that nominal year GDP, 352,000, and divide it by that year's index that we calculated for 1.6. Okay, so 352,000 divided by 1.6 is 220,000. All right, so you can see it's a lot lower because we put it in 1984 prices. So what we've done here is real GDP in 1984 in 1984 prices is 70,000, and real GDP in 2004 in 1984 prices is 220,000. All right, so now they're on the same base year. So this is the actual change in productivity. So you'll see that the effect is not so great when you adjust for inflation, because the price of chicken went up by a little over, 150%. Okay. So yeah, so hopefully we see how to do that. But what you want to do for this one is just create the index by dividing the price that year by the price in the base year. And then by default, if you're doing it right, you're going to get that the base year's index is 1. And then take the other indices and divide the nominal GDP by that index. And then you get it in real GDP for that base year's prices. Okay, so number 4 is, what is this? So this one we're going to calculate the rate of economic growth and also per capita. So number 4 is, let's suppose an economy's real GDP is 30,000 in year 1 and 31,200 in year 2. What is the growth rate of its real GDP? And also, let's assume that population is 100 in year 1 and 102 in year 2. And the last question is, what is the growth rate of real GDP per capita? All right, so we have 2 questions. The first, let's just calculate the growth rate of real GDP. All right, so a percent change or a percent growth is just the change over the original. So this is year 1 and this is year 2. So to get the real GDP growth rate, calculate the difference over the original. So that'll give us the percent change, or that'll give us the decimal term, and just multiply by 100 to get percent. So in year 2, it grew to 31,200 minus the original GDP of 30,000, and then divided by 30,000, the original is 0.04, and then that's, if you multiply by 100, that's 4%. Okay, so it's just a simple percent change, right? Similar to what we did in the elasticity. It's the new value minus the old value divided by the old value. So the change over the original gives us the decimals, and then just multiply by 100, 0.04 is 4%. Okay, so the next part asks for what was the growth rate of GDP per capita. So to do that, we first have to get GDP in per capita terms, right? So GDP per capita is just GDP divided by the population. So in year 1, the real GDP was 30,000 and the population was 100. So per capita, that's 300. 30,000 divided by 100. Okay, and then GDP per capita in year 2, the GDP in year 2 was 31,200. The population in year 2 was 102. So GDP divided by population is roughly 306. Okay, so to get the change or the growth rate in real GDP per capita, let's look at the per capita terms. So what's the change from going from 300 to 306? So GDP per capita growth rate is the new value of 306 minus the old value of 300 divided by 300. So again, the new value minus the old value over the original. And that gives us 0.02, which in percent terms is 2%. All right, and you should notice that if you have any population growth, your per capita term should be a little bit lower because you're taking out the effect of the growing population. So the growth rate of real GDP per capita is lower because it controls for population growth. So if there's more people, then there's less resources or money to go around. So you got to control for population to look at GDP per capita. Okay, so we got one more example here on chapter 10. So let's suppose that work hours in New Zombie are 200 in year one, and productivity is $8 per hour. So that means that each hour of work gives us $8 in productivity. So what is New Zombie's real GDP? And then if work hours increased to 210 in year two and productivity went up to $10 per hour, what is New Zombie's rate of economic growth? Okay, so we learned about this productivity approach, which is that real GDP can be measured by hours of work times labor productivity. So this is the same equation from up here in the key terms. All right, so we used this one in question 2, I think. We were using this one in question 5. Okay, so here is, all we got to do is plug in the values, and then we get our measure of GDP. So real GDP in year one, it was given that we worked 200 hours, and the question said that those hours were productive at $8 per hour. So 200 hours times $8 per hour gives us exactly 1,600 for real GDP in year one. Okay, and then for year two, it asks for the the percent, the economic growth, the rate of economic growth. So first, we got to calculate real GDP in year two. So in year two, 210 hours were worked. The productivity in year two was $10 per hour. So the real GDP in year two with this approach is 210 hours times $10 per hour, which is exactly 2,100. Now, to get the rate of growth, just look at the change. So when it grew from 1,600 to 2,100, what's the percent change of going from this to this? So the rate of economic growth is the new value, 2,100, minus the old value, 1,600. So the change over the original of 1,600 gives us 0.3125, which is a really big increase, but that's 31.25%. Okay, so those are the examples, and some of these you'll have similar examples on your homework assignment, but for not for all the questions. But we got how to use the expenditures approach here. This one you want to know how to create the price index and use that to convert real nominal GDP to real GDP. Just divide by the price index. Number 4, you can calculate GDP growth rate or the growth rate of real GDP by just calculating the change over the original. And per capita, if it asks for that, just divide, it's just GDP divided by the population. And then to use this one, just put in the hours of work and multiply it by the productivity, and that gives you the estimate of GDP. And then the rate of economic growth is the same, the change over the original, and then put that into percent terms. Okay, so questions on any of these examples or these types of problems from chapter 10? Everybody good on what to do for these types of problems? Okay, let's leave this open. Come back there. All right, so that's okay. That was chapter 10. So that was GDP and some of the like intro to macroeconomics. And so good, we still have plenty of time to do chapter 11. So we finished chapter 10. All right, and we got two chapters to do today, so we're right on schedule. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the study guide for chapter 11. All right, and then let me open up the PowerPoint for chapter 11 as well. Okay, so in chapter 11, we're going to learn about three more important things in kind of an intro to macroeconomics material, and that's about business cycles and unemployment and inflation. All right, so first let's talk about the business cycle on slides 2 to 7. Okay, and so the business cycle is alternating increases and decreases in economic activity over time. So you know what economic growth is. So when growth goes up and down around kind of a trend in a cycle, that's what we're calling here the business cycle. So there's four phases or terms of a business cycle: peak, recession, trough, and expansion. And those are clearly seen here in the next figure. Okay, so what the business cycle represents is you have kind of a general growth rate of GDP or economic growth over time, so the growth trend. But you have alternating. Sometimes the economy is doing better, and sometimes the economy is doing worse. But it kind of fluctuates, if you will, around the trend. So the idea is this is the level of output. This is time. There's a long run growth trend, and actual current economic activity kind of fluctuates up and down in a cycle kind of around the trend. Okay, so a peak is a high point, a trough is a low point, and recession is when the economy is declining for a certain period of time, and expansion is when the economy is growing for a certain period of time. So see how this cycle kind of wraps around the trend there? Okay, and so to officially have a recession, you have to have just the definition of an official recession is 6 months of negative economic output. Okay, so an official recession is 6 consecutive months of decline in real output. And so what you'll see here is these are the official recorded recessions since 1950. We've had 10 official recessions, and the current recession is not officially a recession because we technically haven't had 6 consecutive months of decline. All right, so remember, let me see if I can zoom into. Okay, so see these gray areas? These are so I zoomed in, or I just snapshotted from 2000 to now this is real GDP quarterly. So here was a recession we had in the early 2000s. Here was the big recession we had after the financial crisis, the Great Recession. So when you see here, um, the reason why this isn't officially a recession yet, what we just had, is because the economy did so poorly for a quarter that it actually grew after that. So this drop in the first quarter was so bad that the economy had nowhere to go but up, essentially. So because on average we have a decline for 6 months consecutively, I'm not sure if it's officially a recession, but clearly this 1 quarter drop is probably the worst we've ever seen. All right. So the point is, just because it's not officially a recession yet doesn't mean it's not bad, because that that one that drop from quarter 1 to quarter 2 was historic. I mean, in a bad way. All right. So these are all the official recorded recessions that we've had. There's 10 of them since 1950. This is the number of months, and this is the decline in real output. So this is the percent drop on average. You can see the worst one, if you don't count the one we're currently in, is, especially in terms of duration, from 2007 to 2009, it lasted for 18 months, and the average drop was about negative 4.5% in economic output. So, I've been telling students that this is the worst one we've seen, not knowing that there's another one coming currently. Okay, so what causes the business cycle? So what causes the economy to go up and down? So there's fluctuations around the trend, and you can have a number of things. You could have demand shocks, where this is the current state is a number of factors. Okay, so demand shocks are when consumer spending is down. So when demand isn't what it used to be, when people just aren't buying things, that can lead to a recession. Supply shocks are when the goods are like the suppliers can't get the goods, or the prices of those intermediate goods goes up, and so this can also lead to a recession. And so the current recession is kind of a combination of both these things. And we'll see here that the that prices, like the level of prices, are essentially sticky in the downward direction, and that means that when the economy is expanding, that prices are very easily to go up. But when the economy is in a downturn like it is now, the prices might fall, but they fall way behind, and usually the last thing to happen is prices drop. So it's very rare that you have deflation, that prices go down. Okay, and then in a recessionary period, you have um, a decrease in output by definition, and you have an increase, or you have a decrease in employment, which is, yeah, exactly what we're seeing right now. Okay, so what can cause those shocks? And so any one of these things can cause the shocks of the business cycle, and we're kind of seeing a lot of these things. All right, so a regular innovation, we're spending a lot of our resources on things we didn't spend it on before, like masks and ventilators and the vaccine production. Many industries are, uh, due to the COVID-19 situation, less productive, like airlines or uh, vacation, things like that, or you can think of any number of industries. This wasn't really an issue. Like, nothing happened to the trust in the U.S. dollar. There wasn't like a financial collapse. So this was a key factor in the 2008 2009 crisis. We just had an election, or did we? I mean, but that can lead to changes in the business cycle as well, because there's responses to that. Yeah, these ones were more prevalent in the 2007 financial crisis, 2007, 2008, 2009. So right now it's more of the first couple things, and then maybe this could be contributing to the economy as well. It's hard to know. Okay, and then so normally this is what happens. Normally during a recession, the things that are hit the most are durables and non-durables. Okay, so normally during a recession, what you see is that capital goods and consumer durables like cars and houses go way down, but we're actually not seeing that. We've actually seen that. I think the new car, the automobile sales market is doing surprisingly well, and I think that so is the housing market. So normally, what you see is that the things that are not affected during a recession are services, food, and clothing. And these are exactly the things that are being affected now. So this is uh, the most unusual recession, if you want to call it that, because the things that normally are not affected are affected the most, and the things that usually are not affected um, are going up. So it's a very counterintuitive in terms of what's normally affected in a recessionary period. And part of that's because a lot of the services have been, forced to close given the economic shutdowns. But it's still a little bit unpredictable, I guess, that like sales of new cars and sales of houses would be doing just as well as they were before. All right. So first little section was on business cycles and recessions and what can cause those. Next, let's talk about a big, you know, topic, which is unemployment. All right. So let's introduce unemployment, the definition of this on slides 8 to 10. Okay. So here is how you calculate unemployment, or the unemployment rate. So first, you have to break down the country or the economy into three sections. So this purple section, ignore the actual numbers because these are outdated, but the categories are correct. So if you're under 16 or institutionalized, you're automatically taken out of a labor force. So this group is not part of the labor force and not part of the unemployment rate, right? If you can't work due to age or prison, then you're not part of the statistic. Okay, or if you're just not in the labor force. So there's a number of people who are going to school, retired, stay-at-home parents, or just choosing not to work or not to look for work. So those people are not in the labor force either. It's only the people in this category in the labor force that we talk about for unemployment. So unemployment or the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed uh, in proportion to the labor force. So the labor force is all the people who are either working or actively looking for work. And so it's only the unemployment rate by definition only measures the people who are looking for work who cannot find it. So if you're not in the labor force due to school or retirement or personal reasons, or if you're too young or in prison, then you're taken out of this statistic. So this is only meant to measure the number of people who cannot work that are looking for work. Okay. And so it's also a bit skewed because if you work, I think if you work 1 hour per week, you're considered employed. So you're not unemployed. So it's only if you're essentially, if you're looking for work, you can't find any work that you're unemployed. All right, let's talk about there's three big categories we categorize unemployment in. Or first, should we let's look at what happened to unemployment recently. Okay, so here is the monthly unemployment rate in the United States. So this is again the number of people who are looking for work that cannot find it as a percentage of the labor force. So you can see that the the jump in the early months of this year was like unheard of. Let me see if I can. All right, so we have unemployment monthly up to October. So this is the percent over here. So the unemployment rate was about in January about 3.5%, and then in April almost 15%. So this jump is never happened. Going from 3% to 15% is crazy. So now we're looks like we're down to a little under 7%, but still not great. But you can see that during that shutdown period, the unemployment rate jumped to something we haven't seen in years since like the Great Recession of about 15%. All right, so you can see all these key economic variables and what's happened to them because those are being recorded by this, looking at these data sets. All right, so let's talk about the three types of unemployment. The first is defined as frictional, and so this is like transitionary. Kind of think of friction as like in like physics terms, friction. So it takes some time for people to transition or move from one job to the next. So this is people looking for jobs or waiting to take jobs. So if you just graduate college and it takes some time to get into the job, that's frictional unemployment. If you're relocating, that can be frictional. If you're in search periods, so if you're this is like transitional unemployment. All right. So structural unemployment is when the structure of the job opportunities change. So this looks at how like just the opportunities change over time. So 50 years ago, there was a lot more jobs in farming. Now there's a lot more jobs in technology, and so just when the types of jobs change, that's structural change or structural unemployment. When that when people are unemployed due to the nature of the job market changing itself. Cyclical unemployment is just when the economy is in a recession. So if there's just not enough jobs to go around, then we account for those as cyclical unemployment, right? Meaning that we're in the downturn of a cycle. Okay, in which you can, so normally, you look at the next slide. Oops. Okay, so normally we define full employment as something a little bit less than 100% because economically we assume that we're never going to have 100% or 0% unemployment. So the macroeconomic definition of full employment is something less than 100%. It's usually about 5%. And so when we're considered fully employed, that technically means that we're only experiencing we're only experiencing the first two types. So the idea here is that we're always going to have some form of frictional and some form of structural because those things are just going to that's the natural state of the economy. Now, if we have a bunch of cyclical, then that's bad. We're not at full employment like we're at now, and we're in a recession or heading towards one. All right, so you can kind of see that all of these types kind of emulate right now. So there's lots of people who were temporarily laid off and thought their job was coming back and are kind of waiting around. There's some people who think that their job might not be available when the economy changes, and there's just people who there's just not enough work. So all of these things are playing a role now, but this is the big one, and this is what we're seeing, especially when we saw that like 15% unemployment. All right, so we'll come back to unemployment, but we talked about unemployment, how it's calculated, and the different types, and kind of the economic definition of full employment is when there's no cyclical unemployment, but the other two types are considered natural states of the economy. We're never going to have zero unemployment, but clearly what's happening now and recently is much lower than what the potential is. Okay, inflation. All right, so inflation by definition is just a general rise in the price level. And inflation by definition also reduces the purchasing power because if you have the same amount of income and the prices of goods and services go up, you can buy less. So inflation is bad unless your income also goes up. And so what we do to determine inflation is we calculate something called consumer price index. And so this is a basket of goods and services that represent the price level in the economy of things that are not volatile. So this is like housing, food, clothing, cars. So the general price of that basket is what represents what the overall level of prices is. Okay, and what you want to do is put the consumer price index in a base year, and then the chain, and once they're all in the same base year, right? Once it's real, uh, like a real value of consumer price index in the same base year, then the change of that index, if it goes up, it's inflation, right? And if it goes down, it's deflation. Okay, so deflation is when there's a general decline in the price level, and that's essentially when the consumer price index falls. Okay, so to get the inflation rate, just take the change of the new value over the original, and the change in the CPI is the rate of inflation. or in this case, if it decreases, deflation. All right, let me show you the consumer price index data. Okay, so you can see that it's very rare that prices go down. So even recently, look at okay, so this is the monthly consumer price index, and the base year is 82 to 84 prices. So the base year doesn't matter as long as it's on the same base year. But what does matter is see how there's kind of a steady increase in inflation over time, and only during certain big or certain strange times does the price actually drop, like it did here in 2008, 2009, 2008. And look, there was a little drop in February and March, but not what you'd think given the state of the economy. So uh, here's if you look at January, where like the index was like 258, and we're already back above that. So the prices don't adjust to the state of the economy very quickly. Like I said, prices are sticky in the downward direction. So even though unemployment's super high and GDP is down, prices are higher than they were in the start of the year. So consumers are definitely not getting a discount in the prices of goods and services. Okay, and then on slide 17, so we define the rate of inflation. So the change in the consumer price index is the rate of inflation. There's some types of inflation we need to talk about on slide 17. All right, so we can essentially break inflation down into two categories, the demand side and the supply side. So demand pull inflation is essentially excess spending relative to output, or the central bank issues too much money, or this is saying that demand rises faster than we expected, and consumers are saying we'll pay more for goods and services. So this is when demand increases kind of unexpectedly and bids up the price. Okay, then cost push inflation is due to a rise in per unit input costs. So when it becomes more costly, so this is like when a resource price increases. Remember that decreases supply. So increasing demand or decreasing supply, both of those would increase the price level. So this is a supply. This is a demand side issue, right? Demand rises. Consumers are saying we'll pay more for goods and services, and this is when suppliers have to cut back their supply because it's now more costly to supply. So these are like demand shocks, and these are like supply shocks. So you can see that there's been indicators of both of these recently. So like you can think of some examples of, especially early on in the year when demand consumers were bidding up the price of some goods and services. Like so all of those things, especially in like March, so nothing really happened to the value of those things. What happened is that people wanted them more because either they thought they needed them or they were scarce. So what happened is stores either put limits on some of those goods and services or they raised the prices. So I definitely saw an increase in the price of all those types of goods, especially in the months of March and April. Okay, and then there was also some inflation, most likely due to the fact that suppliers couldn't get some of the goods and services. So if there's a cutoff or there's if it's harder to access or more expensive to get intermediate goods, then suppliers would increase the price of their good as well. Okay, so if there's things that are imported, I just picked tech goods as an example. So if there's things that are imported normally, and there's all of a sudden a tariff or a tax or some kind of restriction that imposes like a trade war, then that makes it more costly for businesses to get those goods, and they have to get them. They might get them from U.S. suppliers, but most likely those uh, sources are going to be more expensive. So if there's any kind of restriction on things that are normally imported, the people who are going to pay the most or be affected are the consumers because they're going to pay higher prices. So any kind of tariff on goods that are normally supplied internationally might be good for some of the suppliers in the US, but for consumers, that's going to increase prices. That's going to lead to cost push inflation. Okay, so we talked about Business cycles, unemployment and inflation. We looked at how unemployment's gone up and then down in the recent months. We looked at how inflation went down a little bit, but for the most part, prices have risen, uh, even though the economy is not doing well. Here's the data. Here's the link to that data, that web page with all the data. If you want to look at that. This is just something that's showing that the box office movies, when we used to have movies in the box office, that they need to be adjusted for inflation, because every time you hear like this is the biggest box office movie ever, that doesn't mean in real terms it is. So you have to adjust for inflation. And there's a bunch of videos you can look at, GDP, business cycles, fiscal policy. Um, Macro goals and unemployment, and then another one on inflation. And so you can take a look at these videos when you get a chance if you want some more on any of these topics. All right, so everybody following along here, any questions on unemployment, inflation before we do some examples? Okay, so um, what number one? All right, so what are the two primary phases of the business cycle, and what tends to happen to real GDP, unemployment, and inflation during these phases? So the two phases are when the economy is growing or declining. So recession is when the economy is declining, and normally during a recession, if we're, I mean, like I said, I don't know if this is officially a recession, but we can think of it as one. So right now, what's happening? Real GDP is declining, unemployment's gone up, but what you see is that prices still don't really change much, or they rise. So prices don't adjust like other variables when there's a recession, and so we had a slight drop in prices. But normally during a recession, prices are unaffected. But as we see during an expansion, prices go up. Okay, the other phase is expansion when the economy is growing. When there's an expansion, by definition, the economy is growing, so real GDP is increasing. Unemployment goes down, and normally during an expansion, there's an increase or inflation, and prices go up. Okay. Two. How many recessions has the U.S. experienced since 1950, and then which ones were the longest in duration, and then which ones were the most severe in terms of declines in real output? So not accounting for the current one, because that hasn't officially been announced as a recession, even though you can think of it as one. But the previous 10. So the U.S. had 10 recessions since 1950, official recessions. And the longest one of those 10 was by far the 2007 2009, after the financial crisis. And that was also by far the worst one in terms of average declines in real output. Okay, so not talking about the current recession, but the previous 10, the longest one in duration was the financial crisis, and that was also the most severe in terms of declines in real output. Okay, what are the three types of unemployment? And then unemployment is seen by some as undesirable. Are all the three types undesirable, and what does that mean? So the three types we talked about were frictional and structural and cyclical, right? But The one that's really undesirable and not considered part of the economy is cyclical, which we're seeing a lot of now. So that's undesirable because it indicates we are moving towards or in a recession, and we're definitely seeing a good number of cyclical unemployment in the current state of the economy, especially in February, March. All right, number four, let's briefly distinguish between demand pull and cost push inflation. So demand pull is when consumers are bidding up the prices. So this is like a demand shock. So excess spending relative to output, or the central bank issues too much money. This is like a supply shock when suppliers have to cut back supply because the cost of supplying that good or service is increased. So this is due to a rise in per unit input costs, supply shocks, and the cost of supplying increases. So supply decreases, that causes inflation. Both these things, or individually or together, can lead to inflation. Okay, so number five, let's suppose that a country's annual growth rates were so these are percents, so 5%, 3%, 4%, all these values in a yearly sequence over a 10-year period. The question is, what was the country's trend rate of growth over this period, and then which set of years demonstrates an expansionary phase of the business cycle, and then which set of years illustrates a recessionary phase? Okay, so remember the trend rate of growth is just the average growth rate over the whole period of time. So this, all right, the trend rate of growth is the average over the whole historical data. So this is the trend. So to get the trend, just take the average. All right, so the 10-year average or the 10-year trend is take all the individual growth rates, add them up, and divide by 10, and you get, on average, the trend was 2.7 or 2.7%. Okay, so an expansion, by definition, is when the economy is growing in output. So you can see, so these are all percent changes. So this is like 5% growth, 3% growth, 4%. This is -1. So the economy dropped by 1%. So if the economy is growing, we're in expansion. If the economy is declining, we're in a recession. So years 1 to 3, growing at 5%, 3%, and 4%. So even though the growth rate went from 5 to 3, the economy is still growing, so we're still in an expansion. But in years 4 to 5, the economy fell by 1% and fell by 2%. Those are recessionary periods. And then years 6 through 10, the economy is growing at 2%, 3%, 4%, 6%, 3%. All right, so anytime the economy is growing, that's an expansion. And then when the economy drops, or is declining in growth, then that's a recession. Okay, then number six, we're going to calculate inflation based on a consumer price index. So if the CPI was 110 last year and 121 this year, what is this year's rate of inflation? And remember, this is they're put in the same base year. So assume this is like the real CPI. It's in some base year. So the change indicates the change in prices. And then in contrast, suppose the CPI was 110 last year and is 108 this year. So the price level went down. And what is this year's rate of inflation? And what do economists use to describe the second outcome? Okay, so the first part is this consumer price index, the level of prices went from 110 to 121. So what's the percent change? And the percent change in the CPI is the inflation rate. All right, so I use this the pi symbol is the macroeconomic symbol of inflation. So this, when you see this is just in macroeconomic terms, this is the rate of inflation, this symbol or this indicator. All right, so the rate of inflation for part A, or the first part, the CPI grew from 110 to 121. So what's the change? 121 minus 110 over the original, that's in decimal 0.1, so that's 10%. All right, so going from 110 to 121, prices grew by 10%. In the second part B, let's call it, prices fell from 110 to 108, so that's a drop. So the new value is 108. The old value is 110 and the original is 110, so the change is going to be negative. So that's negative 0.018, and in percent terms, that's negative 1.8%, and we call a drop in the price level deflation. Okay, so that was chapter 11. I think those are all the examples there. So any questions on any of these examples for, what do we got here? Business cycles, recessions, types of unemployment, types of inflation, trend rates versus expansions and recessions, and then make sure you know how to calculate the rate of inflation based on the change in the CPI, and also know that if the price goes down, that's a decrease in the inflation rate, and that's deflation. Okay, so because these chapters were not too long, I combined the homework into one assignment. So I made a homework assignment for chapters 10 through 11 together. So there's just one homework assignment, but it comprises some of the material from both chapters. Okay, so here's the homework for chapters 10 and 11. So this is material from both chapters we just did. So there's a number of questions, but they're pretty short. So you had question number 1 on using the expenditure approach to calculate GDP. Number 2 is you're calculating the growth rate of real GDP. Then you're determining GDP per capita and getting the growth rate of GDP per capita. So there's a good example on that one we just did. Okay, this is on the business cycle. So just draw the business cycle and explain the goods that are normally most affected, even though the current business cycle is a little bit different. Number 4 is on the types of unemployment and the definition of full employment based on the types. Number 5, the types of inflation. And number 6, you just have to calculate the inflation rate in a couple examples here. So there's 6 questions, but some are just short answer and pretty short questions, and you should have an example. Most of these questions from the ones we did in the examples. Okay. So, any questions on what I want you to do for these questions for the homework assignment here? Okay. So, let's see. Okay, so that homework assignment, I just made a section for both. So just the chapter 11 homework together is due in a week, and you can post that there just like you normally do for your homework assignments. So that's due next Wednesday. Uh, and then next time, okay, so next time we're going to talk about fiscal policy, which is how the U.S. government uses its policy tools to affect the U.S. economy, which it's done a lot recently. And so chapters 12 and 13, we're going to cover some the key parts of those next time. So next time, another double chapter day, but shouldn't be too bad because we're trying to build up the fiscal policy. So uh, make sure if you haven't submitted your midterm to do that. I think most of you have. Um, if you want to do the extra credit, you can submit that by the end of tonight as well. This chapter 11, chapter 10, chapter 11 homework is due next Wednesday, and then next week we'll talk about fiscal policy and cover some of the key points of chapter 12 and chapter 13. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to cover for today. We were pretty productive and got done 2 chapters. So thanks for participating tonight. And if you don't have any more questions and are good for the homework and the exam and everything else, then that's it. And I'll see you next Wednesday at the same time. And everyone, have a good rest of your week.
Have a good night, Professor.
You too. Thanks.